Today's lesson will cover Chapter 8 on Political Geography, Key Issue 1, Where are states distributed? First, we will talk a little bit about how political geography is understood and how humans create political geography. Then we will be talking about challenges in defining states. It's important to note that state is synonymous with country. So when we use the term state in geography, we're talking about countries around the world. We're not referring to a state as one of the US states. Again, I cannot stress this enough. Make sure that anytime you are using the term state, you understand that you're talking about a country. So a formal definition of state is a political unit with control over internal and external affairs. Essentially, what this means is that a country or state has control over the laws that they create domestically, but also with how they deal with international politics and diplomatic relations. Key issue 1 goes over a few complications when it comes to the sovereignty of states. First, we'll take a look at North and South Korea, then China and Taiwan. Third, we'll look at the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands. And lastly, we'll talk about the Sahrawi Republic or the Western Sahara. First, let's talk about North and South Korea. The Korean Peninsula was a colony of Japan for about 35 years. And after Japan lost the war in World War II, it had become independent. The peninsula ended up being divided into two occupational zones. So you had the United States on one side and the former Soviet Union on the other. The Soviet Union was supporting the North to try to instill a communist form of government, and the United States was supporting the South to instill a democratic form of government. A 3-year war between the North and the South started in 1950 and ended in a ceasefire, which technically is still going on today. So many would argue that the two countries are still engaged in war, although they have laid their arms down and are technically at a stalemate. Both governments are committed to reuniting the country into one sovereign state. However, both maintain that they are the one that should exercise sovereignty over the entire Korean peninsula. So the disagreement on what kind of government should persist if united is still a discrepancy. The next conflict is between China and Taiwan, and it's over whether or not it should be considered one state or two. Most countries in the world consider China and Taiwan separate states. Both China and Taiwan believe to be part of the same country, but they disagree on what that looks like exactly. The discrepancy stems from a civil war between China and Taiwan that began in the late 1940s between two government groups, the nationalists and the communists. When the nationalists lost to the communists in 1949, they fled to Taiwan. Even though the nationalists fled to Taiwan, they still proclaimed that they were the legitimate rulers of China. With plans to come back and defeat the communists later, the nationalists had continued to take control of the government, at least on the island of Taiwan. Since the United States had been so anti-communist, especially at this time, they supported the nationalists, which gave them some legitimacy. The United States had very much opposed recognizing communist China. They continued to recognize the nationalists, who technically only had control over the government in Taiwan, as the legitimate government that still had authority over China. It wasn't until the 1970s that this changed, and with US policy changing, the United Nations voted to transfer China's seat from the nationalists to the communists. Today, it is fair to say that China and Taiwan, although they still identify as being unified, still are two sovereign territories that have autonomy and govern themselves. Take some time to observe this map, located on page 266 and 267 of your textbook. In the 1940s, the world contained only about 50 countries. Compare that to today, where we have close to about 200 countries. The key will indicate to you when states had become their own sovereign countries. You'll also notice in the map that all of the political boundaries can give you a sense of what countries have the largest land mass. The largest states are those that are considered to have more than 5 million square kilometers, and these states include Canada, the United States, China, Brazil, and Australia, with Russia being the largest in land mass with 17.1 million square kilometers. In contrast, there are also very small states. The smallest states are known as microstates. These microstates have very small land areas, and the smallest state in the world is Vatican City. Vatican City is entirely encompassed in the city of Rome. It is also only 0.17 square miles. Other microstates include Bahrain, Liechtenstein, Micronesia, and Singapore. On this map, you will notice that the colors indicate the date of the United Nations membership, and nearly every state is a member of the UN. This brings us to our third territorial dispute, the dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. Technically, the dispute over these islands in the East China Sea are claimed by China, Japan, as well as Taiwan. Japan claims the chain of islands as the Senkaku Islands. China claims the chain of islands as the Diaoyu Islands. And Taiwan claims the chain of islands as the Diaoyu Tai Islands. Japan has controlled the islands since 1895, except between the time frame of 1945 and 1972. This is because the United States administered them after defeating Japan in World War II. China and Taiwan, however, claim that the islands historically belonged to China until the Japanese government illegally seized them in 1895. Today, Japan claims that because China did not state that it had sovereignty over the uninhabited islands back in 1895, then Japan was fair to claim them. Today, China and Japan both have established air zones in the East China Sea that have conflicting boundaries, boundaries that both claim the territory of this chain of islands. The last dispute we're going to talk about is with the Western Sahara. We can start with a conflict over the name of this territory. Morocco claims this territory as the Western Sahara. However, the Polisario Front, which actually controls the far eastern portion, claims this as the Sahrawi Republic, or an independent state. It is important to note that most African countries actually consider the Sahrawi Republic a sovereign state, so they don't regard it a territory of Morocco. In asserting their claim over this territory, Morocco has built a 2,700 kilometer or 1,700 mile wall around the territory to keep out rebels. Just a little history, Spain actually controlled this territory, but withdrew in 1976. When Spain pulled out, an independent Sahrawi Republic was declared by the Polisario Front, and this government was recognized by most African countries. Instead of recognizing this territory as an independent state, Morocco and Mauritania annexed the northern and southern portions. 3 years later, when Mauritania withdrew, Morocco claimed the entire territory. To be fair, Morocco does control most of the populated area, but the Polisario Front operates in the vast, sparsely inhabited deserts, especially the 1/5 of the territory that lies east of Morocco's wall. The United Nations has attempted to step in to mediate, but they have failed to reach any kind of resolution between these two parties. Take a look at images A and B. These images can be found on page 269 of your textbook. In image A, you can see that Morocco built sand walls, and these walls were built during the 1980s to isolate the Polisario Front rebels from fighting for their independence of the territory. In image B, you can see that Morocco controls the western portion of the Western Sahara, and the Polisario Front controls the eastern portion. This is the end of the lesson on Key Issue 1 of Chapter 8 on Political Geography. Please return to Google Classroom and watch some of the supplementary videos to get a better sense of these specific conflicts.